So we're going to get started now. My name is Perry Merling, and I am chairing this session. I know nothing about growth and inequality. I'm a consumer of this literature, let's put it more positively, rather than a producer of this literature. And I just, as a framing, I've been just 2 weeks ago, there was a session at Columbia University, which is where I'm from, with Branko Milanovic and Sanjay Reddy, about exactly this question of growth and inequality. And I remember Branko Milanovic using some data from at the state level in the United States, arguing that the states that had the worst inequality had the worst growth. So the line of causation, in his mind, goes from inequality to growth. I was wondering in that session about the reverse causality. Perhaps I'll learn something more today. And then, of course, last night we had the opening plenary of the conference, and with Thomas Piketty and Joe Stiglitz and so forth. My main takeaway from there is that the Kuznets curve seems not to be true fact about the world. That is to say, there is no trade-off between growth and inequality. It seems, in fact, that they move together, at least more recently. I'm connecting that in my mind with the talk that Sanjay Reddy gave 2 weeks ago about the distinguishing the post-war period. The first half of which was about really the recovery of Europe, and the second half of which was about the rise of China. And so these are the sort of historical facts behind that change in 1970. I really look forward to this session. We have a very full session, 4 speakers. I'm going to ask them to quite rigorously stick to 15 minutes each, and then a discussant. Probably there will not be so much time for discussion, maybe no time for discussion at the end with general, but we will get some ideas on the table, and the discussion will happen in the halls or at lunch afterwards. If the speakers feel they need discipline, if they need me to discipline them to 15 minutes, I will, okay? But I'm hoping that they will be self-disciplining. We have 4 speakers. To my left, Facundo Alvarado, Gabriela Ramos, John McCombie, Lance Taylor. I'm not giving all of their details. They're in the program. In the interest of time, I suggest that we just get started with Facundo. If we could have the first presentation.
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me here. I hope this doesn't arrive as a disappointment, but I'm not going to talk much about growth and some about inequality, and I'm not going to talk much about the 21st century, and I will explain why, and more about the 20th and even the 19th century in this presentation, which is about the distribution of wealth with a focus on the distribution of wealth in the UK since 1896. So perhaps you know, perhaps you don't, that there's a new wave of studies on wealth, in particular on wealth income ratios, and on inheritance, and on the distribution of wealth in a number of countries, mainly developed countries. You have the work of Piketty and Zugman about the wealth income ratios, and there's a new paper about the distribution of wealth in the United States by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zugman. There's some work in progress doing in France. There's our work with Tony Atkinson and Salvatore Morelli and myself on the distribution of wealth in the UK. You have the Credit Suisse report, which has much publicity by Shorrocks and Davis, and some more work that perhaps is not shown, is not visible yet in Spain, for Spain, Denmark, Belgium, Germany, Sweden, and some other countries. But the truth is that there are a number of potential data sources for this wealth studies on wealth. You have the household surveys with all the shortcomings they may have. We have the inheritance data and the related the state multiplier method, where we use inheritance data and the inverse of the mortality rates. You have now the rather popular capitalization method, where you use the incomes, the capital incomes, you multiply it by the return rates, and you reconstruct the distribution of wealth. You have the registers in those countries with wealth tax data, which are only a few. Spain has wealth tax, France, but not many countries, not the US, not the UK. There are some use of the rich lists. Forbes at the world levels, the Sunday Times for the UK, and a combination of data sources with what we call hybrid methods, where people try to use rich lists, registers, and surveys. All these works have motivated that I showed the homepage of the World Top Income database because I am the manager and I have a news to tell. Is that given all this work on wealth and wealth income ratio and the distribution of wealth, we are going to convert the World Top Incomes database soon into what we call the W2ID, the World Wealth and Income Database. So we will keep the top income series that posted there every year for every country in the database, but we will introduce information on wealth for the countries available, and statistical information on the distribution of wealth income ratios, and a new project which is the DINAS, which I list there, which is the distribution of national accounts. That I don't have much time to give details on this, but this will happen at some point between the end of 2015 and the beginning of 2016. On top of the problems associated with the different sources for wealth information, we have also to ask inequality of what and among whom, what's the wealth we are measuring and who are the individuals or the units we are using. Because I have to confess that my main goal with this presentation is not to inform you about the level of wealth concentration or wealth distribution statistics in a number of developed countries, but I would like to leave you with an uncomfortable feeling the next time you see a plot of the distribution of wealth. And I'd like you to question what's the numbers you are seeing there. Don't take them at face value. So I'd like to stress some of the problems we face and some of the problems we see in other people's work. One of the problems is the other data sources. Other problem is the unit of analysis. For state data, we are targeting the individuals, but if we use wealth data, it's the tax unit. Sometimes it's the individual, sometimes it's the household, the married couple. In the case of survey data, the statistics are based on household, are based on the household as the unit of information. For those works with show statistics based on the rich list, here there the complication is even bigger, because you have individuals in the rich list, but sometimes you have couples, you have even brothers or even families. So the statistics are sometimes difficult to homogenize in terms of unit. Then we have the problem of valuation. Of course, we are taking a very, I would say, a neoclassical or mainstream version of wealth. We are not considering wealth in the Marxian tradition. But even within this narrower context, we have the problem of the valuation. Its realization, its market value, its going concern value for the companies. And then we have the geographical coverage. It's the domicile, what we should take into account. Sometimes it's the residence, sometimes it's presence. For example, again, for the rich list in the UK, you have this individual, Abramovich, which I don't know if he should be considered as a member of the distribution of wealth in the UK or not. So those are the things that we should particularly pay attention when one sees the results based on different data sources. So in the rest of the few minutes I have, I will show some of the results we have with Tony Atkinson and Salvatore Morelli for the UK. And as a comparative measure, I will show some results for the US and France. I don't have more time to focus on the other countries. But this is a plot of the share of the top 1% of the wealth distribution in the UK. This is the existing evidence. So there is more or less a consensus that there was an increase in concentration until the beginning of the 20th century, then a large decrease until the 70s. And during the last 20 years, there's a number of sources. You have the Piketty series, you have the Her Majesty, the official tax office series. You have the official wealth survey series. and the Credit Suisse report, and they are, honestly, what do we know? This becomes more and more complicated. So let me make some focus on this plot. This is for the observations for 1670 to 1870, 200 years, comes from Peter Lindert. And as in the previous plot, the idea was that wealth concentration had been growing over that period. But we have to be honest and show what Peter Lindert provided in his original work. He gave also a rather large confidence interval. So within that, okay, he has a preferred estimate. There was an increase, but his own confidence interval makes it difficult to assess what precisely was going on. Let's make a zoom on the later part, on the more recent period. You have 1970 to 2014, 2010. And there you see more clearly the discrepancy between the series, the official Her Majesty, the Revenue and Customs series, the Sherlock series, the survey, which is a huge difference. It's between 12% for the survey and 25% for the Piketty series. So what we try to do is to reach a consensus, even if we know as perhaps the lower bound for the share going to the top 1% of the distribution of wealth in the UK. But we have reconstructed all the series using the mortality multiplier method. For the UK, the main data source is the inheritance tax data. And we constructed this continuous series between 1911 and 2011. There's one addition, one of the value added that we can provide now, is that we can look within the top 1%, which wasn't done before. So there is the same drop between 1911 and 1970, a level off in the 70s and 80s, and potentially an increase. That's what the figures show. The figures show in the last years. But we can look within the top 1%, and this is rather striking, not striking for comparatively with other countries, but within the top 1%, there you have we break up by half. You have the bottom half of the top 1% and the upper half of the top 1%. And you see that there wasn't much going on with the bottom half of the top 1%. There was a decline in their share, but most of the action, again, as happened with most of the top incomes cases, most of the action was happening and had been happening within the top half of within the top 1%. The relationship between the two, the shares of the 1 to 0.5 and the 0.5 to 100% distribution was 5 in 1911. The relationship dropped to 2 in the 80s, before around when Margaret Thatcher arrived in government, and then now increased to 3. And we can also compare this, the evolution. You have in green there the same series as before, based on the estate multiplier method. And in gray, you have another data. This is the same data source, but from another methodology. This is just the gray. It's just the distribution of estates. You take the estates, the inheritance reports to the inheritance tax, and you plot the distribution of estates within states, and you see how similar those series are, except for the last few years and the first years. And this is something that we are still trying to assess what's going on behind that. But the commonality was remarkable for most of the period. And on the upper part, you have another series with the triangles, which is another method with another data source, which is the capital incomes. This is the information coming from the tax files. And for that, we only take the incomes in the capital income, dividends, interest, etc., and we just plot the distribution of capital incomes within the total capital incomes. And again, even if the levels are not the same, because there are missing incomes in the capital income part, but the dynamics shown by the two sources, which are totally independent, are similar. So these are the results for the UK, which is based on our own work, ongoing work. And then you have the now rather famous in the US paper by Saez and Zuckman, using a different method, the capitalization method, where they only use the capital income from the income tax. Whereas in the mortality method, the mortality multipliers, the mortality rates are key to the method. Here, the return rates are key. The problem you have to estimate the return rates for an individual makes all the difference in your results. And they get a more or less similar, the flavor of the results are similar. All the action was happening within the top 1%, at the top 1% level. The problem comes when we compare their own estimates with the state multiplier method for the US. There you have the comparison for the top 0.1% from Saez and Zuckman, the capital income method, and Kopchuk and Saez from the mortality multiplier method. Both theories, that's gray, that's in black for the capitalization method, and the white triangles for the state multiplier method. The two methods are more or less okay until late 80s. And then something happens. Either the capitalization method is overestimating the concentration of wealth, or the state multiplier method is underestimated the concentration of wealth, or the truth is between these two series. It is a real issue. It is a real issue that if you look at the rich lists, you will see how long-lived those rich people are. And the mortality rates, I mean, the life expectancy for those rich people have increased enormously. So it's true that perhaps there's a particular feature that we are not capturing properly, the mortality rates by gender, by age, and by wealth. So there's a problem in mortality multipliers which show this what it seems to be constant and not increasing. But this is one of the problems for the mortality method. But again, what I like to stress is that we are not completely sure either that the capitalization method is showing the right numbers. And just for the sake of comparison, this is the series for France by Piketty, which is mostly based on inheritance data. I want to stress one issue, that you see that the drop between 1910 and 1970, the top 1% share goes from 60% to 20%. This is exactly, more or less exactly, what's happening in the UK, and somewhat different here, the top 1%. In the US, the share of the top 1% is somewhat lower in the 1920s, and the drop is not so marked. So let me, just the time's over, so just to give you a few conclusions. The state-based wealth estimates show a long-run fall in top shares from around 1910 to the 70s in the UK and France, and then there's much work to be done. The truth is that we, at least for the case of the UK, the UK could improve enormously the access to data. And we are doing, I think, much work on this side. We need to get access to better data, and the government do have the data to provide. And trends seem to be corroborated, at least for some periods, between the capital income method and the mortality multiplier method. Well, the divergence in the case of the US, I've already mentioned between the reasons that may lie behind the difference between the mortality method and the capital income method. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good with the time. Our next speaker is Gabriela Ramos from the OECD.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It sounds? Okay. Thank you. I'm very, very pleased to be here and to share with you some of the analysis of the OECD on this question related to growth and inequality and the impacts that they have among themselves. My presentation, of course, is going to be less technical, because the organization, of course, is pretty interested in having the best data and the best indicators, the best trends, the best measurements. But we are more interested in the policy conclusions. And we are more interested in what do we do about it. So even though, of course, we have been benefiting from the work like Facundo and many others have been doing in terms of trying to really disentangle all this relationship and trying to have the granularity that we require to understand all these issues, is not the object of our effort. Our effort is to say, what do we do about it? And how do we move about it in terms of policies and in terms of informing our policy makers in what needs to be done. So, but in any case, I think that the OECD has also been at the forefront in trying to document the increased inequality in income, and now we are moving also with the waves and with the fashion to try to document increased inequality of wealth. And this is related to the project that we launched after the crisis, because we all knew that we were not very well prepared to understand why it happened, and why it happened. That we should take a look at not only the flows, but the stocks, and try to capture it better with the tools we have in the policy making to understand the relationship and the impact. So we have now, of course, confirmed that income inequality is on the rise. In mid-90s, and John Evans is here with us from the Trade Union Advisory Group at the OECD. They were at the incept of this work. We have been documenting how much income inequality has grown even in those countries that are pretty much equal. Because we are not talking, you're not talking about my country, which is Mexico. It's very well known that is highly unequal. We're not talking about all the emerging economies. Of course, they are included. You're talking about Norway, you're talking about Sweden, you're talking about Denmark, and all of those models, social models, that we always recognize as being quite equal. They have also been suffering for increased income inequality. We confirm that during the 80s and 90s, the average income of the richest 10% is now 9 times on average. And I have to say that we are also becoming very distrustful of averages, but still, in average, for the whole OECD countries, the top 10% now has 9 times the income of the bottom 10%. After the crisis, this has not receded, is 9.5. Which is not very good news, because if we move from 7 to 9 in 2 decades, we are moving from 9 to 9.5 in just 5-7 years. So it's not improving, and of course it has to do with all what we see in the news, the high unemployment, long-term unemployment, the youth that don't have any options in life. In my country, the relationship is 25 to 1. In the US is 14 to 1. In Brazil is 55 to 1. In Chile is 27. So it's different for different countries, but the only consistent message is on the rise. And this is the trend that we are not very happy about it. This without taking into account the wealth, of course, because this is only taking into account what we can measure as income. But if we consider wealth, of course, the issue goes broader, and this is also another aspect of the research agenda that we really need to capture much better, and where many academics, including Piketty, are doing a great contribution. It's very complicated because the OECD is always trying to ensure consistency and comparability among the data that we have from different countries, and therefore the conclusions sometimes are not so straightforward, because you don't have the same quality of data and you don't have the same availability of data. And this is something, for example, that we are always suffering when we're trying to document what is happening in the emerging economies, which is also very important, because those are the countries which growth is happening, but we don't know how the distribution of the benefits of growth are being shared among the different income groups. What we know is also that if you look at the top 1%, from 1976 to 2007, 47% of total income growth in the US was captured by the top 1%. So this is the figure when you look at what happened at the top of the income distribution. And it has to do, of course, with the structures and the models and the many trends that we have documented in terms of these issues. Now, when we started documenting inequality, I have to say that some of our member countries were completely against it because they thought we were going to be pushing for equality of outcomes, which is not possible because in general there are so many determinants in terms of success of people and the success of their own availability of tools and opportunities. But what we could do is to try to push for equality of opportunities, at least. And this is, I think, the minimum of what governments should be doing. And more if you consider now that is really the object of our discussion now is economics, but we cannot disentangle this from the fact that there is a lot of social impacts, that there is a lot of political impacts, that what you see now in the general context is a total lack of trust in governments. And so these are other elements that we are not touching upon that, but that is making more difficult. And we are seeing it everywhere. It makes it more difficult to get the support for any kind of reform because the societies are so divided and so distrustful that it's impossible to move anything anywhere. So, but the focus on growth. We also have now documented that inequality has a very strong impact on growth, and for those issues that we can measure, because I'm sure that there might be some other aspects, and one that comes to mind is how the financial market breeds or not inequality, how much it's really focusing and producing or being an inclusive financial agenda. How is it working now differently from where they were before the crisis? But we have at least focused or putting the emphasis on the question of skills, and I'm going to share with you some of the elements there. You remember that for many years we used to say that inequality was good for growth, which was normal because it was creating the incentives for people to thrive, and those that put more effort will be rewarded higher. But now the reality is that not everybody starts with the very same initial position. And so that's where we come in terms of looking at the granularity of the information that we have. Instead of looking at what happened at the top 10 or 20% or looking at the average, what we are now trying to focus is what happened at the lower scale of the income distribution. And this is where you find how growth is hampered with higher inequality, because we're just looking at those. We're not looking only at those that would need support for poverty purposes or to be receiving the most social transfers. We're looking at those, at the working poor, which is 40% of the population of the OECD member countries. It's huge, but that's how it is defined in the work that we have been doing to define this relationship between inequality and growth. And so what we found is where overall inequality is higher in a society, there is a clear pattern that is emerging. People from backgrounds that are low income or disadvantaged invest much less in developing their human capital and their education and skills, essentially. So there is just a compound effect of all these children that are not receiving the good quality education that they deserve or the tools to thrive in life that just add up to these huge lost capacities and potential that hampers growth. By contrast, this inequality doesn't have any impact when you look at the results in terms of skills for the high income groups. So it just stays the same. And I want to show you one of the graphs because, again, in terms of having good access to and the indicators and the analysis, we have the program for international student assessment, which assess how much kids know when they're 15 years old. But we have translated that in terms of numeracy, literacy, and mathematics to measure how much workers from 15 to 65 know. And then this puts the emphasis on those that are already in the labor market. And what the graph tells us, which is striking, because this is the results of the PIAC, this other instrument that we have to measure how much the workers know and use their skills. You can see that on the vertical axis you have the numeracy scores. So that's it, the performance of those that were surveyed by the PIAC. And in the horizontal line, you have the inequality. And the graph that emerges is striking, because what you see is that even in very equal societies, there is always a very important gap, almost 40 points, from those that come from low income groups or disadvantaged families, and those that are average. And so you have a difference in terms of their performance. But when you move into more unequal societies, the drop is just dramatic, which means that in reality, those kids that come from low-income families in highly unequal societies are just condemned not to have any investment on their capacities, or to go to schools that are not providing them with the tools that they need to succeed in life. And this is tragic. And this is not something new, because for those that are more in the political science, you know in which neighborhood you go to school will determine a lot how much you can advance in your career going forward. So instead of breaking the link of your socioeconomic background, the system is just reproducing it and making it worse. And this is it goes against progress in society and progress on growth. So this same report that we produce then just compounded by the fact that you have 40% of the population in these groups and highly unequal societies has just slashed growth in the last 2 decades of about 10% in Mexico, of about 9% in the United Kingdom, or 6 and 7 points in the United States, Italy, and Sweden. So this is just the initial remark that I wanted to do. I think that it's pretty striking. As you mentioned also this question of health. Yesterday, Secretary General Gurria was mentioning that those that are in the low income groups probably will have shorter life expectancy, which is dramatic. Or they will have, of course, less access to financing, less access to land, less access to legal. I mean, it's just this compounded. So, in terms of policies, I have mentioned we are developing the Inclusive Growth Initiative, because the other aspect of this analysis is that it's not only about income. Yes, it's very important to look at income because it is one of the drivers of progress, but it's not only about that. I think that if we are really going to take a look at well-being, at people's well-being, we need to broaden the scope and include many other dimensions that matter for people. That has to do, of course, with this provision of services, which is health, education, infrastructure, but also we need to think about wealth. As I said, more complicated to measure, but it's another element. And of course, there are some other issues in which the OECD is working that makes the thing a little bit more complicated when you talk about subjecting well-being. And when you ask people what do they care about and how those policies or policy making can support improving their outcomes. This Inclusive Growth Initiative that goes into this multidimensional well-being is also looking at the distribution of outcomes, because we are moving away from the averages. When you talk about enacting certain policies, you would need to really take a hard look at how it impacts to the low-income groups and how different policies may have different impact in different income groups. So there is no longer one-size-fits-all of kind of reforms that the countries can do without testing it in how much you're helping or not to advance the position of those that are more disadvantaged. And I would have to say, you just better take a look at the 40% at the lower end if you really want to succeed in these policy issues. One of the recommendations derived from the Education Department of the OECD has always been that when you organize the education systems, you really need to put more resources and the best teachers in the most disadvantaged schools. And you know the politics of it is quite complicated because as you move in as the teacher, you move in your career, you want to go to the best schools, not to the worst. But this is the kind of policy conclusion that you will need to arrive at that level of definition if we really want to change this trend. And I would leave it there and Yep, I don't think I have any other graph, but it would be great because there are many other considerations. The question of tax benefit system, the question of enabling tools to support different income groups, the question of regional policies. There are many issues that we need to consider. But if there is one single aspect in which we really believe countries should be focusing is this question of skills and skills for the low income groups. So.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is John McCombie.
They're putting it.
Ah, they're putting it on. Sorry.
It looks like.
Oh, thank you very much. My presentation doesn't have too much to do with growth, except for the very last section, which may have to go. We've only got 15 minutes. What I want to look at is why income inequality and the problems are not treated seriously by a large proportion of the profession, the orthodox profession, and the question why we should actually worry about it. I start off with just a quotation, and I'd like to just draw your attention to the Robert Lucas statement that nothing is as poisonous to sound economics as to focus on questions of distribution. And the question, I think, is why? Why are these statements made? And if you want a more recent statement, look at Mankiw's In Defense of the 1%, published in 2013. And that is the neoclassical approach of the marginal productivity theory of distribution. And it goes back to John Bakes Clark in 1899, where he actually argues that there's a natural law that every agent of production will take what that agent creates. And of course, it doesn't imply that every agent ought to receive what he produces, but that normative step is often implicitly taken. And the heart of this is the marginal productivity theory of distribution, which is taught, I think, almost uniformly in most macroeconomic textbooks. And the implication is, of course, that income distribution is a technological phenomenon based on things such as the elasticity of substitution and the supply of labour. Nothing to do with social norms or bargaining power or anything like that. So if we don't have to worry about income inequality, the argument, I think, as was mentioned last night, we have Oken's great contradiction in that if you want a more equitable distribution of income, you're going to have to sacrifice some efficiency, I'm afraid. So the question I want to look at is what are the problems in testing the theory of distribution, and can we do it directly or indirectly, and should we abandon that and the agri-production function completely? Well, I just started off with a sort of illustration of the changes in income distribution. This is the ratio of the chief executive officers to workers' compensation, and I think it just shows dramatically the change that's occurred since 1990, where you can see there's been an explosion in earnings of the top 1%. Some indication as to why that might be occurring, nothing to do with marginal productivity, is you'll notice the very close correlation between that and the stock exchange, which tends to imply that maybe there is some difference in CEO compensation, which is now related very much to stock auctions. So, can we actually test the marginal productivity? Can we have any defense of this along neoclassical lines? Well, in 2007, the hedge fund manager John Paulson received 3.7 billion in earnings. Now, I had to go back and check that. 3.7 billion? Well, was this his marginal product? If it was, how can we test it? Well, a long time ago, Lester Thurrow, about the same time as Oken was writing his book, had a do-it-yourself guide to marginal productivity. Now, I'm not going to go through all these questions in great detail, but he posed some questions which he tried to answer. For example, what is the theory that determines whether marginal productivity groups are large, small, heterogeneous, or homogeneous? I mean, most capitalist societies, individuals are part of teams. So how do you distinguish between the marginal product of one team and another member of the team? What's the level of aggregation? Do we have a competitive model? What about increasing returns? His net answer to all these was, well, actually, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to test marginal productivity at the individual level. I suppose at this conference, one must always make some reference to Piketty. And in his book, he actually has a discussion about the illusion of marginal productivity, where he says, well, it's rather naive to look for an objective basis for CEOs' high salaries in individual productivity. But, and I think he gives too much away here, he says when a job is replicable, such as a fast food server, we can give an approximate estimate of the marginal product of that worker. I don't think you can. Let me give you a very simple example. I will not go through the equations, you'll be pleased to know. But just think of a fast food server, the McDonalds if you like. How does it determine its pricing? It's normally a markup. It's a markup on its total unit costs. Costs here are total wages and the ingredients. That would go through to the national accounts as value added because you simply take away the revenue minus the cost of the ingredients. Now, supposing an extra waiter is employed, what will happen? Well, the value added will go up by 1 plus pi times W. Now, if you were to look at that as a neoclassical economist and to look at the marginal product, you see it's closely related to the wage. But the causation is completely different. It's not from the marginal product to the wage, it is in fact from the nominal wage through the accounting identity, the marginal product. And if you want an exact replication of that, if you just have a markup on labour costs only, you'll get the same result. And a long time ago, Phelps Brown, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, this is the same time as, ironically, Solow was publishing his aggregate production functional technical change, looked at the identity, an accounting identity that must always hold in the national accounts, and the reduction function. And he noticed that if you look at the marginal product from the identity, you get a definition of the factor shares. If you go through all the normal optimization with a production function, increase constant return to scale, etc., you get a relationship which is exactly the same. And he sort of queried this, saying, well, maybe the output elasticity of labor and wages are the same side of two sides of the same coin. Maybe the causation is from the identity to the production function. So maybe the production function, does it exist? Again, Piketty is somewhat ambivalent about this because in his book he does talk about CS production functions and he talks about the distribution of functional shares being due to the elasticity of substitution of greater than 1. And this led to a debate about whether his measure of wealth is the same as capital in a production function. He put forward his 3 fundamental laws of growth. And of course, the great debates about this was within the neoclassical paradigm. Solow's growth model was resurrected, and it was compared with that. Bob Rothorn looked at the CS production function. And so it was really submerging his arguments within the conventional neoclassical approach. Other explanations, I think, such as Cowdell's macroeconomic theories of distribution, really didn't get a look in. So I say, is it an illusion? Well, there's a substantial body of work that says the aggregate production function theoretically does not exist. A long time ago, there was something called the Cambridge capital theory controversies that have now almost been forgotten, but they were a theoretical argument. They arose from Samuelson's attempt to generalize the one-sector model to more than one sectors through his surrogate production function, and the debate conclusively showed that that could not be done. You cannot move out of a one-sector model to a multi-sector model using an aggregate production function. And in fact, it was conceded by Samuelson himself in 1966. The debate rumbled on for about 10 years and then petered out and was largely forgotten. Solow just described it as ideology masking as macroeconomics. So if you think the overtones of that were too ideological, all you need to do is read any of Franklin Fisher's work, Franklin Fisher of MIT. I don't think he'd object to being called a quintessentially neoclassical micro-foundation economist, but you'll see from the quotation I've got there that he argues that an aggregate function does not exist. It's not a real event. The aggregation problems are so severe that you can't use it. And interestingly, he says one cannot escape the force of these results by arguing that aggregate production functions are only approximations. You can't use that argument. So why is it used? Well, because it gives good statistical fits. And neoclassical economists rely on Friedman's, probably the only essay and methodology they've actually read, which just simply says no matter how implausible the assumptions, if you get good statistical fits, then you can have some faith in the theory. And this is now permeated down through to all the introductory textbooks. I just selected Random Mankiw's Macroeconomics. Paul Douglas himself used this argument. However, Herbert Simon, in his Nobel Prize lecture, sort of reiterated the arguments that Phelps Brown had made, and he was saying identical results can be readily produced by mistakenly fitting a Cobb-Douglas production function to data that were originally generated by the linear accounting identity. So just recall back to the argument about Phelps Brown and to my example about the fast food definition of value added there. Paul Samuelson himself, in a review of Paul Douglas's work, which was far from hagiographic, actually comes across makes the same argument. That he reinvents the wheel and says that, in fact, the aggregate production function may well be meaningless, but does not, in his subsequent work, take that any further. So, what is it? Can I explain the argument in 3 minutes to you? Probably not, but I'll have a go. If we take the identity, which always holds under any conditions, just simply differentiate it, then integrate it, you get something on the right that looks remarkably like a Cobb-Douglas. That is not an approximation. Those are definitional relationships. So what are you doing if you look at cross-sectional data? Well, you've got a straight line, which is the accounting identity, and Herbert Simon conveniently said, well, what's the error if we actually put a Cobb-Douglas to the accounting identity? The error is about 5%. You'll get an R-squared of about 0.95 if you estimate cross-sectional production functions, and you'll always find the output elasticities equal the factor shares because of the identity. It's sometimes forgotten that Paul Douglas in the 1930s ran many, many regressions using cross-sectional data, and he found precisely that. R-squares of 0.95, output elasticities equal to factor shares and constant returns to scale. Why? Well, the argument is on the diagram before you. Time series data, the argument still follows through. The only difference now is the A, which is the constant of integration in the cross-section, now has to be approximated by a linear or a non-linear time series. If you get a close enough approximation, you'll always get back to the identity. So what I'm arguing here is that the standard defense that it gives good fits is in fact to a large extent spurious. So there are some common misconceptions about this. It doesn't just apply to a Cobb-Douglas production function. If you have variation in factor shares, the identity will give you a CS or a translog. If you want to move away from talking about production functions, just think of it as a Box-Cox transformation of your data. It's not an identification problem. You can't solve it through simultaneous equations. It's not an econometric problem. And it holds for any underlying structure of the economy and when an aggregate production function does not exist. There's a small caveat here that I'm going to gloss over. Don't confuse it with a single sector accounting identity. If you look at neoclassical micro-production functions, yes, they have an identity, but it is the price in pounds or in dollars times a single unit of physical output. It is not value added and what I'm talking about here. So just a plug for a book that's just in paperback by Jesus Felipe and myself that goes into this in a great lot more detail. So, if you're still doubting Thomas's, the best thing is to simulate, because if you have simulations, you know precisely what the underlying structure of the economy is. There are 3 papers I'm citing here. In all of them, we know definitely the aggregate production function does not exist. It cannot be aggregated. But when we run it with the data generated through the simulations, we get very good fits to the Cobb-Douglas and the CS production function. Again, Frank Fisher in 1971 said, well, the causation is not from the production function to factor shares, it's from factor shares to the production function. I would just draw your attention to one of the authors in the second paper, where they explicitly say the aggregate CES elasticity of substitution does not exist. I'm running out of time, so I've gone perhaps a little bit too fast through this, but anyway, I've got a very strict chairman here. I just thought I would say something a little bit about growth, and I think there are three very important papers that have just come out that I've listed, and they actually confirm that the level of sustained growth, or growth spells, is inversely correlated with the degree of inequality, and the effect's large. Inequality is bad for the length of sustained growth. They also confirm that income inequality is bad for growth. It's not because high income inequality countries redistribute a lot. There is an argument that it's the redistribution that brings down growth. These papers, I think, argue the converse. And I think the last paper really consists of looking at the impact of education on inequality. And I think now we're getting econometric evidence that inequality is bad for growth. Occam's trade-off, I think, is unwarranted. There's no need to be concerned. And I'd like to just finish on a very pessimistic note. What I'm arguing that the standard tools of neoclassical economics, the discussions of Piketty's growth models through neoclassical economics is spurious, and they're not very much used for analyzing economic growth and inequality. So once we move away from that, we've got to start talking about what's the optimal degree of inequality. This takes us to the political scientists and rules and things like that. And how effective are government policies in achieving redistribution in the advanced countries? The argument from my reading of the political sciences is virtually nil. If you look at the way that policies are determined by both the Democrats and Republicans, who determines it? It's the top 1%. And there's a lot of empirical evidence on that. And also, in my own country, with an election coming up, inequality does not seem to be a major factor in it. So on that slightly pessimistic note, perhaps a more positive note, in developing countries it may be different, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our final speaker, and before we move to the discussion, is Lance Taylor. If we could have that presentation. Yeah. There's a timer on the
button, or?
No, it's there.
Yep. That's it.
Display.
Is it here? Oh, okay, very good. What I would like to do is basically discuss, here's a quick summary of what I want to say. I have too many slides, but in any case, what I do was set up a demand-driven growth and distribution model with the growth rate and income and wealth distribution stable, and they all reach a steady state. Also, income and wealth are sensitive to social relationships and policy. That is, you could increase low wages, you could reduce markups, you could have less vigorous capital gains. So let me go through four issues. One, I want to quickly look over the old-fashioned 50-year-old Cambridge, UK distribution and growth theory. These are old ingredients, but the recipe maybe that I have is new. Second, I want to say something about the significance of capital gains in the income and wealth distribution. Take a quick look at the current distributive situation in the US, and finally review some simulations of what may happen to income and wealth under various hypotheses. The old Cambridge growth theory, not the production function, the sort of things that John was talking about, but more on lines of Calder and Pazinetti. There's a simple class structure. To begin with, it's a theory of the functional income distribution, and how I get back from there to the size distribution is something that has to be explored. But there's a simple class structure. There are capitalists who only get profits on capital. That is, they have some capital KC, K sub C. And you have workers who receive both capital income and wage income. There's a little bit of notation. U is the output capital ratio, R is the profit rate, G is the ratio investment to capital, and zeta is the ratio of capitalist capital to total capital. So that's your distribution. This is a demand-driven growth model, as opposed to, say, what Joe and Tomas were talking about last night, where basically they're talking about the sort of model that John was just criticizing. The output capital ratio and the growth rate are both endogenous. There's no aggregate production function. no Say's law, no marginal productivity conditions, et cetera. I talk about a medium run. If you think of, say, the standard neoclassical model, the medium run essentially says there's full employment and marginal productivity conditions and all that. My medium run is based on Marx, sort of 150 years ago, when you have the reserve army, which grows, and that puts pressure on profits, and then you get a crisis in the old usage. That was formalized by Dick Goodwin in 1967. Basically, what I'm assuming is demand is profit-led. Profits go up. That stimulates investment. And there's a profit squeeze. That is, when employment goes up, the profit share gets squeezed. And then there's some positive feedback. If you think of the share in wealth of the top 1%, they save a lot, so that if their share goes up, that cuts into aggregate demand. On the other hand, if aggregate demand goes down, the profit share tends to rise because the reserve army grows, and that leads to positive feedback into zeta. That zeta, the last zeta in the slide, should have a dot over it, but somehow that disappeared. There's a steady state with zeta dot equal to 0, which is the one described by Pazinetti, where there's essentially growth is equal to the saving rate of the capitalist times the profit rate. Both G and R endogenous in this model, whereas the growth rate was exogenous for Pazinetti. And then there's a distribution of wealth. The point I want to make about the distribution of wealth is one that goes back to James Mead. That is, capitalists only get capital income, whereas workers get wage income, which can provide saving, which can be accumulated. So there's a difference in the possibilities for accumulation. Now, let me say something about profits and capital gains. P&P, or Piketty and Pazinetti, they mysteriously assume that households get access to all profits. That is, all the total profits, or the rate of profit times capital, or the capital share times output. But if you look at the system of national accounts, they only get interest and dividends. That is, there's an identity that holds almost exactly in the national accounts, which says that total profits are equal to financial transfers to households, that is interest and dividends, plus business saving. Now, the question is, how in the short to medium run do households get their hands on business saving? The way they get their hands on business saving is through capital gains. That's the chief transmission mechanism. And if I have a chance for a sort of 20-second anecdote, under the first Bush administration, there was a big political debate in the US about whether capital gains taxation should be increased. It turned out to be increased a little bit, but that increase was opposed very strongly by the first President Bush. And obviously, he was defending his class interest. I mean, he comes from a family that lives off capital gains, and that's how they get access to profit flows. Here's a simple set of balance sheets. Households hold equity, and they have their own residential capital. They have some debt, and they have some wealth. Business owns physical capital. Their liabilities are equity, debt, and their net worth. You can then go through a little bit of algebra, which I will skip, but basically the result of that algebra is that there should be a dot over many of these things. The change in business net worth has got to be equal to business saving minus depreciation of their capital, minus capital gains on the equity, minus the increase in the price of capital on the equity that they have outstanding. I mean, obviously, the real world accounting is more complicated, but this is the gist of the story. And the interesting thing is that if you look at this diagram, you see capital gains, the blue is at the top, then the yellow, this diagram is wrong. It should be net business saving as opposed to net business investment, but you get the same story in that diagram as well. And notice that typically since the mid-1980s, that this is the capital gains come from a CBO, Congressional Budget Office study, which I'll mention in a minute. But since the mid-1980s, on the whole, capital gains have exceeded net business saving, which means there's been a transfer of wealth from the business sector to the household sector, which in fact is excessive in the sense that the capital gains have exceeded the saving of the business sector. And so business now has fairly strongly negative net worth in the US, or if you like, Q is greater than 1 as a consequence of that. So you have this process going on, and I think it's probably a pretty important factor behind the increase in inequality. It's interesting, by the way, that if you compare both Piketty and Stiglitz last night, recognized that a good chunk of the increase in wealth inequality had to do with basically increases in the value of capital. And that's what this capital gains phenomenon is about in this particular diagram. Joe put a lot of interest on land rent as opposed to business saving, and I think probably business saving is a better way to look at it. But you do get similar stories in that regard. Now let me say something about how well does this very abstract model, which I've gone over very abstractly, how well does it conform to the data? Now, the CBO study is quite interesting because it takes a look at sources of income for different groups within the size distribution. So you can get some kind of handle which enables you to try to map between the functional distribution and the size distribution. And if you try to do that, so what we did in some other work at the New School of Social Research was basically rescale the CBO the CBO distribution data, rescaled it to fit the national accounts, which is fairly standard procedure. The World Bank has been imposing that kind of manipulation on developing countries for years. But I haven't seen anybody do it for the US besides us. But what comes out is the following. Suppose we look at the top 1%. And here you get the diagram, which I can probably explain fairly quickly. At the bottom, you have wage income in the green. That's essentially, or labor compensation, which is somewhat more complicated than wage income. But notice it's not a very big share of the income of the top 1% in the US. Next step up, they get a good chunk of proprietors' income. That is, proprietors' income is sort of lawyers' fees and subsidies received by big farmers. I happen to live in the state of Maine. Americans will recognize the author Stephen King, who's made a lot of money out of writing books about horror, and he has a lot of royalty income, and he's obviously well up in the top 1%. Then you have interest and dividends, and then you have capital gains. Interest and dividends are yellow in this particular diagram, and again, the capital gains are on the top. So the top 1% is not the same as Pazinetti's capitalists, but there is certainly a degree of overlap in their relative positions, insofar as the top 1% gets a lot of proprietors' income, interest income, and capital gains. Let's look at what we call the middle class, which we chose more or less arbitrarily to take the households between the 60th and the 99th percentiles. And the important thing there is that they get a lot of wages. Look at the green. The main source of income for what we're calling the middle class is wage income. At the bottom, the red is transfer income. That is Social Security and Medicare for these people largely in the way the US operates. They get some interest, they get some proprietors' income, not very much. They get some interest in dividends in the yellow. And then they get a little bit of capital gains. But on the whole, this group between the 60th and the 99th percentile are reliant on wages. If you can also note a couple of other things. Bulk of income from labor concentration. They have positive saving. The saving rate for the rich group is higher. And they have the federal taxes that they pay are not much lower than the top 1%. The average rate for the top 1% is in the range of federal taxes is in the range of 25%, which is obviously not very progressive. The tax rate for these guys, or these middle-income households, is not much lower than that. The reason why it's not much lower in the US system is that they pay a lower rate of direct income tax, but on the other hand, they're hit hard by what is called FICA, which is the tax on labor, which goes to support the US Social Security system. That's actually a pretty robust tax, as it turns out, for these people. Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. And then if you look at the bottom 60%, the mean household income is in the range of $55,000, which is more or less in the same area as the median. They have negligible net worth. The top 50, 60% in the US have maybe 1% of wealth. They have minimal or negative direct taxes. They're hit hard by FICA. And the consumer budget data suggests that they have negative saving rates below the 50th or 60th percentile in the US. That comes out very clearly in the consumer budget data. Now, what does that mean? In practice, it means there are people moving in and out of poverty. It means there's a lot of social support within family networks. It means that there's a lot of lending which doesn't get repaid. Again, I live in rural Maine, and I have engaged in that kind of lending with various people, and that's just what one does. And I might also add, living in rural Maine, there are a lot of deer get shot in the woods by poachers. So, there are sources of income that people have at the bottom of the income distribution that they have, which just aren't captured by the consumer budget data. In any case, the picture looks like this, with the data that are available. Big transfers at the bottom, that's the red. The green is wage income, and then they get minimal financial incomes. So what can you do to try to generalize from this kind of data? So we set up a very simple-minded, let me say, but it's just a multiplier model, but complicated in the sense that there's a lot of detail that you have to keep track of if you're trying to make distribution data consistent with the national accounts. And fortunately, I have people helping me who get the headaches, and I just sit back and supervise. But there are, the data are based on the National Income Product Accounts, the CBO income, Bureau of Economic Analysis consumer data. The particular runs that I'm talking about will include these three household groups. There's a profit-led, profit-squeezed medium run of the type that I was discussing. There's investment by households and business. And we simulated capital gains to hold business net worth constant. I mean, obviously, in some years, capital gains will exceed the change in net worth. Other years, they'll fall short of the change of net worth. That was true after the stock market crash. So we just simulated to hold business net worth constant. And basically what happens, these are very preliminary results. Basically what happens, the solution goes to a steady state with fairly slow convergence, sort of greater than 5 or 6 decades, which is standard in these kinds of models. The Piketty profit rate greater than growth rate condition is satisfied, but if it goes to a steady state, the share of wealth in the top 1% has to stabilize. The share of the three classes income is fairly stable, and you get asset price changes. Let me run very quickly through the simulation results. You get these kinds of diagrams coming out. GDP growth rate starts out about 2.2%, goes down to a bit above 2%. You get exponential growth of GDP in the second diagram. Capacity utilization levels off. Household incomes, those are small, relatively small changes for household incomes. Profit rate drops slightly, profit share drops slightly. Equity price, share price grows fairly rapidly, but then levels off because of this transfer mechanism. And the share of the top 1% begins in the range of 35% and stabilizes at about 50%. So the top 1% is not going to take over the world in these simulations because the world goes to a steady state. And that steady state is going to limit the top 1%. However, their share does increase. And then there's a question of what changes might do something about that. And I just want to run quickly over 3 or 4 different changes. One would be a positive shock to nominal wage rates for the lower 2 classes. Then that reduces concentration of wealth. That is, if you raise wages at the bottom, that's going to shift income toward the bottom 2 groups relative to the top group. The top group will have less access to resources, and in that sense, the Mead observation that accumulation from wages matters is important. A negative shock to the profit share slows growth and marginally reduces wealth inequality. And if you cut back from 100% capital gains distribution to 75%, then that hits the guys at the top. These are not, this picture is not that easy to see, and we obviously want to be doing some more simulations. But the base run is the blue. The shock to wages, the red, increases GDP growth and reduces wealth concentration. The shock to markups doesn't do that much. That's the green, the shock to the markup rate. And finally, if you reduce the wealth share distributed to households, it doesn't go down. It doesn't have much effect on growth, but it does substantially reduce the share of the top 1%. Now, all this is very preliminary in a very simple-minded model, as I say, but I think it's what's important to recognize is that you can set up a demand-driven growth model which will go to a steady state and which gives reasonably plausible results. It's sensitive. It shows that the wealth share is sensitive to factors that can be controlled they can be, if not controlled, at least affected by policy and social interventions. And the world, because of the Mead mechanism, there's some limit to accumulation of the top 1%, although obviously that limit is very high. Finally, thanks to INET for supporting this research at the New School. So that's it.
Thank you. And I think we have just enough time for our discussant. So thank you all for keeping to time somewhat. Nadia Garbellini, please. No slides. Okay.
No.
If there is time at the end, I'll actually ask the panel to respond to you. I think that's probably the first priority. Yeah.
Working? Yeah. Okay. So, well, it's quite difficult to go through all the issues which have been touched upon in this session in only 10 minutes. I will try to do my best. So, first, I was just thinking of difficulties which are inherent in trying to connect data on income distribution and theoretical issues when basically we have been listening to people talking about mainly personal income distribution, so different quantiles, while I think that theory, both neoclassical and non-neoclassical theory normally just deal with functional income distribution, so how profits and wages are, how the net product is distributed among factor shares, so wages and profits. And I think that all the discussions about income distribution I have been listening to in the latest times just only concentrate on personal income distribution and never on functional income distribution, which might be, in my opinion, a drawback. And of course, this was quite clear in the first presentation when we were told that actually interest in income distribution stems from the unit of analysis, which is the individual, and therefore, of course, we are bound to talk about personal income distribution. And this connects, of course, to the role that institutions should have in income distribution. That is to say, I think that a society is not just the sum of many individuals, but just work in quite a different way. So we have been told that basically neoclassical theory, we have been reading for a long time that inequality is useful for growth because it provides the incentives for people to work harder and therefore provide the system with more resources and therefore more growth. And then we are seeing that this is not so but just because people do not start from the same initial conditions. So the implicit policy conclusion should be that governments should just limit themselves to remove differences in initial conditions and so let the incentives work properly, and therefore everything is going to, growth is going to follow I totally disagree with this approach in the sense that I think that the role of the government should not be that of just removing differences in initial conditions. Of course, this is part of it in the sense that I think that, especially when talking about schooling and this kind of institutional issues, it's very important that, to try to eliminate differences in this sense. But I also think that since a society is not just the sum of different individuals, we should also have, growth can, in my opinion, just stem from considering how this productive structure of each country has been evolving in the latest years, and then trying to have projects like industrial policies or something like that, in which government should have an active role in designing what should be produced, how, and whatever. So this is totally different from the prescriptions of neoclassical theory, and I think that there cannot be agreement on this if the theoretical approach is the neoclassical one, which goes in the direction of governments just have to let the market work properly and let incentives work properly. Just a couple of things on Piketty's. Well, even if he is not here, he is here because our session is clearly dealing with his work somehow. So we are been listening, talking about stock and flows. So one of the problems I think, one of the difficulties I had in following Piketty's reasoning is he sums up flows, talking about income, and stocks, talking about wealth. And talking about stocks, he has many stressed, including Robert Solow, who was quite enthusiastic about the book, but still he noticed that the definition that Piketty gives of wealth, capital, is quite surprising in a sense, because it is totally, in my opinion, disconnected from what capital is intended in the theoretical framework he himself uses for trying to give theoretical soundness to his reasoning. But the thing which I think is particularly astonishing in the way in which he deals with wealth is that he considers total wealth as the sum of private and public wealth, where private wealth is just given by the institutional sector, which is households and non-profit institutions. So he basically disregards totally the role of corporations, which means, first of all, that we have some unincorporated business which are into the household sector, but then all corporations are into the corporation sector. But in that sector we also have, for example, the central bank, because central bank is not part of general government in the flows of a sequence of accounts, but it's part of corporations. So basically the way in which Piketty measures wealth, national wealth, is such as to consider, for example, state bonds bought by a central bank as a decrease in national wealth, while we know that if bonds are held by people inside the country, this is not so. So I think that this is quite strange, also because the proportion of business which are incorporated or not in different countries is very different from country to country. For example, Italy has quite a high proportion of unincorporated business with respect to corporations, while for other countries it's very different. can imagine the United States, for example. So making comparison, inter-country comparisons on the basis of this definition of wealth, I think makes really little sense. And I think I almost used all the time I had. So last thing I wanted to say is to Professor Taylor, who I think already knows because I already gave him some comments to his paper, and concerns basically his interpretation of Pazinetti's theory of income distribution. So I think that Pazinetti never assumed that, Pazinetti's approach is not a descriptive one. So whether you like it or not, the way in which he proceeds, but what he does is simply describing conditions for equilibrium. So he is not describing what actually happens in an economic system, so that he's not assuming that actually in an economic system things work like he is saying, but just identifies conditions for equilibrium growth. So it's a normative and not a positive approach. And therefore, I think that it's totally different from what Piketty does, and I think also quite different from what Professor Taylor pretends Pazinetti is saying in his article on income distribution. So I just ask myself whether we read the same paper, but it's okay. So I think I finished my 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. My clock says 12:14:52, so we have 5 seconds if the panel wishes to have any response. If anyone is so moved.
I would say that I didn't say that just equalizing initial conditions is the only way forward. I said it's just a great place to start. The other kind of recipes have been contested and have been tried in reality, and I remain to be convinced that that's the way forward. But let's just give the children for low-income groups a better start in their life. So.
Very good. So I'm sorry, because we had such a large panel, we're really not going to have any discussion, but there is a long lunch, okay, and that's a big chance for discussion. So let's just leave it there and have lunch. Thank you.